So the next section, we are going to use the quadratic formula. So while I'm talking, write down the quadratic formula because I have it written off to the side. I'm not going to reference this slide. I'm just going to use it. So we'll talk about how to find A, B, and C. It's the same as with graphing. It's the same as with factoring. But factoring typically is only useful when my answers are whole numbers or easy fractions, I would say. So it only is helpful to use factoring sometimes. You can always use the quadratic formula. So if you have the option to factor, but you find that you like the quadratic formula, you can use the quadratic formula. But I'll show you some cases where factoring is not really logical to use. So I don't know what number I'm on. I'm just going to say I'm on number 10. Is x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. And so here's what I'm talking about. I could factor this because I know two numbers that multiply to be negative 5 and add up to be multiply to be 5 and add up to be negative 6. It would be a negative 5 and a negative 1. And the zero product property that you used in chapter 7 says that if these two quantities are getting multiplied to equal 0, then one of them has to equal 0. Either x minus 5 equals 0 or x minus 1 equals 0. And so I could add 5 to both sides, x is 5, or I could add 1 to both sides, x is 1. And so the two answers to this equation are 5 and 1. If I were to graph this quadratic, this parabola, it would cross the x-axis at 1 and 5. I can't use square roots in the same way because not only do I have an x that's getting squared, but I also have another x here and they can't be combined. So I could have used the quadratic formula on number 10, but I don't have to. So number 11 says 12x squared minus 4x minus 5 equals 0. So I could actually factor this. I could use the AC method because 12 times negative 5 is negative 60, and the two numbers that multiply to be negative 60 and add up to negative 4 are negative 10 and 6. So I absolutely 100% can use this factoring strategy. I'm going to use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to say that A is 12, B is a negative 4, and C is a negative 5. So I think I'll write down the formula for the first one. Negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. There are all sorts of songs on the internet to help you memorize the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, or the opposite of b. So if b is negative 4, then what's going to go in the formula first is positive 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So when I take negative 4 squared, I get positive 16. Minus 4 times a, which is 12, times c, which is negative 5. All divided by 2 times a, which is 12. So if I wanted to just take 2 times 12 and put 24, I could save myself a step. So start inside the square root. Simplify what's underneath the square root. So I've got 4 plus or minus the square root of 16. Now look here, I've got minus a negative, so it's going to end up being a positive plus, and 4 times 12 times 5 is 240. Or if I thought about this as 16 minus a negative 240, either way it would end up being plus. So underneath the square root is 16 plus 240 divided by 2 times 12, which is 24. So I've got 4 plus or minus the square root of 256 divided by 24. So I have my calculator nearby. The square root of 256 is 16. So I've got 4 plus or minus 16 all of that is divided by 24. So this plus or minus tells me that I've got two separate answers here. I'm going to take 4 plus 16 divided by 24, and then I'm going to take 4 minus 16 divided by 24. So the plus or minus can be separated into plus and minus. So 4 plus 16 is 20 over 24, which is a decimal 0.83 repeating. So I'm actually just going to simplify it as a fraction. Both of those numbers are divisible by 4. So 20 over 24 reduces to be 5/6. So one of my answers is 5/6. And then 4 minus 16 is negative 12 divided by 24, which simplifies to be negative 1/2. So my two answers are positive 5/6 and negative 1/2. So if I were graphing this, it would cross the x-axis at positive 5/6 and negative 1/2. So graphing is only, I would say logical to use if your answers are whole numbers, because I don't know if you would see a graph crossing at 5/6 and go, oh, that's 5/6. So I could use the AC method and factor, or I could use the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is not a short process. There are a lot of steps. So it's important that we're careful with our algebra, because one little mistake is going to totally mess up your final answer. So let's look at number 12. So number 12 says 2x squared minus 5x plus 3 equals 0. And so here's the thing. When I do this problem, I could try and to find the two numbers that multiply to be 6 and add up to be negative 5. I could use the AC method if I wanted to, or I could do the quadratic formula. So if I let 2 be A, negative 5 be B, and 3 be C, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, which is the opposite of b, which in this case is the opposite of negative 5, which is 5, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So I like to go ahead and do b squared off to the side. Negative 5 squared is 25, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 3, all divided by 2 times a, which is 2 times 2, which is 4. So I'm taking this and simplifying. So start underneath the square root. So I've got 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 4 times 2 times 3 is 8 times 3, which is 24, divided by 4. So I've got 5 plus or minus the square root of 1 divided by 4, and the square root of 1 is 1. So 5 plus or minus 1 divided by 4. So I've got 5 plus 1 divided by 4, and I've got 5 minus 1 divided by 4. So 5 plus 1 is 6 over 4, simplifies to be 3/2 or 1.5. 5 minus 1 divided by 4 is 4 divided by 4, which is 1. So the quadratic formula, you can combine steps as you're getting good at it, but if you're going to ask me questions, I need you to show your work, because I'm going to need to, be able to analyze where you made your mistake.